Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the November edition of the Maths, Science and Technology Education Group seminar series. My name is Scott Cameron. I'm a lecturer here at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and it's my pleasure to host today's session. Today I'm also joined by Dr. Cath Pearn, a senior lecturer in primary education, and I'm also joined by Sarah Buckley, Dr. Sarah Buckley, who I'll introduce shortly. Today, Cath will be moderating the Q&A session after Sarah's presentation. Feel free to post any comments or questions for Sarah using the Q&A function. This session is also being recorded and will be available on the MGSE YouTube page if you want to share later. Before we begin, Cath, Sarah and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we are meeting today, the lands of the Wurundjeri, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Sarah Buckley, who will be giving a presentation entitled Understanding and Addressing Mathematics Anxiety Using a Multidisciplinary Perspective. Sarah is a Senior Research Fellow at the Australian Council of Educational Research. Over the last 5 years at ACER, Sarah has driven several initiatives designed to address mathematics anxiety in both pre-service and practicing primary teachers. Sarah was a postdoctoral research fellow in the Science of Learning Research Centre and has worked on large-scale international studies, including TIMSS and PISA. Sarah completed her PhD in psychology at the University of Melbourne, which investigated the impact of motivation and peer networks on adolescents' mathematics anxiety. I'll now hand over to Sarah. Once again, please remember you can ask any questions or provide any comments using the Q&A function. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for the introduction, Scott, and thanks for having me as part of the seminar series. I would like to present today just a body of work that we've been doing at ACER, looking at understanding and addressing maths anxiety and doing that using research from a couple of different disciplines. So to start with, I just want to quickly review some things about maths anxiety. So firstly, maths anxiety is considered the tension, worry, nervousness associated with carrying out mathematical tasks. We know from research that it's reported in children as young as 7, that it is reported at higher levels by females, and that there's mixed data in terms of its prevalence in the community. So some researchers estimate about 5% of the population might be highly maths anxious. Others estimate about 17%. And of course, this is going to vary according to country. So before I continue with some of our work and our model for understanding maths anxiety, I just want to go through a few of the constructs, motivational constructs that are associated with it and linked with it, because I'm going to talk about some of these later on. So confidence beliefs are very important and obviously related to maths anxiety. So at the most general level, we have ability beliefs or self-concept. So thinking that you are good at maths, for instance, and then at the more specific task level, we have self-efficacy. So judgments that of how well you believe you're going to do at the task level. Then we have these things called control beliefs, which are related to the things that you think control your learning and performance in maths. So if you have an internal locus of control, then you believe that the factors that control your maths learning and performance are internal to you, things like effort. Whereas if you have an external locus of control belief, you believe that the things that control your maths learning and performance are not within your control. So for instance, genetics or luck or the teacher or things like that. We also have value beliefs, and I've differentiated into 3 types of these here. So we have interest or enjoyment beliefs, you enjoy maths or you don't. Utility beliefs, so how useful you perceive it is for your career or for your future. And attainment beliefs. So this is more the level of value that you attribute to maths that's related to your sense of self. So for instance, you may have high attainment value beliefs if maths is important in your family, or for instance, if you consider that maths, being good at maths or maths is valuable because of its link to, for instance, general intelligence, which is a myth out there as well. And lastly, we have achievement goals. So if you have a mastery goal, you're trying to achieve in maths because you want to improve your skills and improve your competency. If you have a performance orientation, then you're wanting to perform and achieve well in maths so that you can outperform others or demonstrate ability. And if you have an avoidance goal orientation, then your ability, your desire to achieve is driven by your need to avoid the negative judgments of others. Okay, so math anxiety has been widely studied, and the main reason for this is because it does have a negative association with learning. So students that report high levels of math anxiety tend to perform at lower levels than those who don't. But we also know that this is, we also know that there are students who don't perform well that aren't math anxious. And we know that some students who are math anxious still perform well. And it's that last group that I'm going to talk about a bit later. But just to provide a bit more data that's local or from Australia, this is from some research that we did a few years ago with about 440 students across 10 primary or elementary schools in Melbourne. And we found that about 15% of students, these students were between grades 3 and grade 6. And we found about 15% of these students could be classified as having high maths anxiety. And we found some associations between this group membership and some of the other factors that we studied. So for instance, students in the high maths anxiety group were more likely to achieve at lower levels than their peers. There was a greater proportion of students from lower socioeconomic schools in the high maths anxiety group, and conversely there was a greater proportion of students from higher socioeconomic schools that were in the low maths anxiety group. We also saw more female students in the high maths anxiety group than males. Okay, another area that's been widely studied is maths anxiety in teaching because of evidence from a few studies to suggest that pre-service primary teachers are a group that can report higher levels of maths anxiety. And there is also research to show that teachers that are more anxious about maths tend to be less confident about their ability to teach it. They can report using more surface level strategies when they're teaching maths. They will sometimes avoid teaching maths wherever possible. And there was also a study in the US which looked at female primary teachers who were maths anxious, and there was evidence to suggest that after a year of being taught by these anxious female teachers, I should say, that their female students tended to endorse more negative gender stereotypes. So there's some evidence of the transmission of negative attitudes as well. Okay, so after that little background, what I'd like to do now is focus on the model that we use for understanding and addressing maths anxiety, and we use research from quite a few different disciplines in order to inform this model. So the first key thing is that we differentiate state maths anxiety from trait maths anxiety. So state maths anxiety is the transient anxiety that is felt on task when a student, for instance, is doing a maths task or anticipating doing a maths task. And this can be differentiated into cognitive and physiological components. So physiological components, butterflies in your stomach, sweaty palms, racing heart, whereas the cognitive component of state maths anxiety are these intrusive negative worries about doing poorly or not understanding mathematics. On the other hand, trait maths anxiety is a more persistent tendency that stays with the individual, and it's related to how threatening the individual feels about, how threatening the individual perceives maths to be. And the reason why we differentiate these two types of maths anxiety is because research suggests that each has a different impact on learning. And as I'll talk about later, we believe that you should use different strategies to address each different type of maths anxiety. So when it comes to state maths anxiety, there is research, particularly in cognitive psychology and neuroscience, that shows how state maths anxiety influences learning in the short term. For instance, some of the most well-known work in this area looks at how, in particular, the cognitive component of state maths anxiety influences impacts on working memory and can lead to working memory overload. Whereas in trait maths anxiety, because it is a persistent tendency that the individual carries with them, that's more likely to influence learning in the long term and influence achievement-related choices in relation to maths, and in particular lead to avoidance of maths. And for this type of anxiety, education research and psychology, in particular social psychology research, can help us understand some of the basis behind the development of trait maths anxiety. So just delving a little bit more into what I was talking about on that last slide. So in our work with teachers trying to help them understand more about maths anxiety, we focus on the fact that state maths anxiety impacts on executive function skills. So like I was saying before, that includes working memory, but it also includes self-interference control and flexible thinking. And so what we try to do is draw teachers' attention to the fact that state maths anxiety impacts on on-task learning. So when a student is doing a maths task, their potential to demonstrate their ability and their understanding can be compromised by state maths anxiety. And a lot of the research, as I said before, is focused on working memory overload. So these negative, intrusive thoughts that are characteristic of the cognitive component of state maths anxiety are there. They intrude on the individual's thinking when they're doing their maths task. The individual starts to ruminate on those thoughts. That leads to working memory overload, which leads to performance deficits. On the other hand, when we're looking at trait maths anxiety, we tend to look at how that relates to motivation beliefs, and we draw, or motivation, and we draw on, in particular, Pearn's control value theory of achievement emotion. And in this theory, Pearn argues that all emotions that are experienced in the classroom are the product of value appraisals and control appraisals. And when it comes to maths anxiety, an individual who has a moderate or high level of value towards maths, and when that's combined with poor or low control appraisals, that leads to the experience of maths anxiety. So when we're looking at trait maths anxiety, understanding and addressing it, our work is focused on, in particular, that control aspect. So what factors influence an individual to develop these poor control or low control beliefs when it comes to maths, because that's one very, very important aspect of their beliefs that is influencing their experience of trait maths anxiety. Okay, so in our work, what we do is we try and present the idea of, or try and advocate for, a direct approach for addressing maths anxiety. And we advocate that using this direct approach in combination with indirect approaches is probably the best way to address maths anxiety. And the reason why we're advocating for a direct approach is because an indirect approach is what is traditionally used in education. So I'll explain that a little bit more. So if a student is anxious in a class, a teacher might look at that student and think, okay, so that student obviously is not confident. So what I can do is I can work with that student to develop their content knowledge, and as a result, their confidence will increase, and then indirectly their anxiety will decrease. And this is a positive strategy that is effective, but there's also evidence to suggest that it doesn't necessarily work long term. And also there's evidence that it does not work for students who are highly maths anxious. And that's because for a student who is highly maths anxious, the last thing that they want to do is maths. They want to avoid it at all costs. So in that way, maths anxiety is operating like a barrier or like a lock on their minds, as this picture shows. So what we're advocating is that a direct approach which reduces and regulates, in particular, the state maths anxiety that they're experiencing, that increased activation in terms of the cognitive and physiological components of state maths anxiety, is very important, because if we can regulate and reduce that experience of the anxiety, then that indirect approach can be so much more effective. Take away that barrier that high levels of state maths anxiety are, And then students are going to be so much more receptive and open to a lot of the ideas that teachers might be trying to work with them on. And so when I talk about a direct approach, one of the things that we advocate in relation to state maths anxiety is emotion regulation. And emotion regulation is when we modify the impact that an emotion is having on us by changing its intensity, by changing the type of emotion that we feel, or by changing the way that it's expressed. And there's a growing amount, or there's quite a bit of research to suggest that emotion regulation, and in particular, one particular skill, emotion reappraisal or emotion reframing, is a very, could be a very successful way to address the state component of maths anxiety. And one interesting study in relation to this was done by Lyons and Baylock. They worked with a group of university students and asked them to do a maths task while looking at their brain activation. And previous to this, they asked them to do a maths anxiety questionnaire. And they found that there were a group of students who were highly maths anxious, and that a subgroup of those students, as expected, did not perform as well on the test. However, they also found another group within the high maths anxiety group. So these students were highly maths anxious, but they did not show the performance deficits that the other students had. And for the students that were highly maths anxious that did not show the performance deficit, they found that before they did the maths task, there was increased activation in a part of the brain associated with emotion reappraisal. So that what the authors concluded was that perhaps these students felt that they were anxious before they started the task, and were actually able to reframe or regulate their emotions so that it didn't have an impact on their performance. And so this research and others suggest that it might not necessarily be the problem that maths anxiety might not necessarily be the problem itself, although it's not a positive thing to experience, but it might be not the fact that a student experiences maths anxiety that has the impact on learning. It's really how they regulate or address that emotion that determines whether or not they're going to have a performance, whether it's going to impact on their performance, or how they cope with that emotion. So in talking about coping strategies, this is just one way of that some researchers look at coping strategies, in particular in relation to stress and anxiety, and they differentiate it into 3 different types. Emotion-focused coping strategies tend to be things like venting, blaming, and one of the key ones is ruminating. And as I mentioned before, ruminating is something that is associated or discussed in relation to state maths anxiety and its impact on working memory. So you have these intrusive cognitive thoughts, you ruminate on these cognitive thoughts, and it leads to working memory overload, which means that you don't perform as well. And research suggests that dealing with stress and anxiety using emotion-focused coping strategies tends to result in more negative outcomes. Similarly, avoidance-focused coping strategies, again, tend to be associated with negative outcomes, and it's avoidance-focused coping strategies that are more likely to be associated with trait maths anxiety. So if an individual has this persistent negative tendency towards maths, if they persistently consider maths to be a threat, then it's not surprising to think that they will avoid it wherever they can. Problem-focused strategies, as you can imagine, are associated with more positive outcomes. And problem-focused strategies include things like planning, a lot of things that are aspects of self-regulated learning, and another type of problem-focused coping strategy is emotion regulation. So our work with teachers and schools is directed at helping them to understand more about this multidisciplinary model of maths anxiety and using it to suggest that dealing with it using a direct approach involves firstly improving emotion regulation, and this is in particular for dealing with the state component of maths anxiety. And secondly, identifying, changing and challenging negative beliefs and thinking about maths to address the trait component of maths anxiety. Now, this is a little picture that we often use with teachers, and it's one that we've developed based on the Yerkes-Dodson theory of arousal, with performance on one axis and anxiety on the other. So what we're trying to show is that a low level of anxiety is often associated with low level of performance because you're apathetic, you're not valuing what you're doing. A high level of anxiety is related to poor performance. That's where we get things like working memory overload. Whereas some anxiety, moderate level, can actually have a positive effect on performance. And it's important to recognize this. And several studies have shown that educating students about the facilitating effects of anxiety before doing a maths task can actually have a positive effect on subsequent performance. So this is one of the things that we emphasize in our work with schools and teachers. We are not trying to get rid of anxiety. What we're trying to do is reduce and regulate it to a point that it is no longer harmful for learning and performance. Okay, so now I'd just like to go through some preliminary findings from some of our work with pre-service teachers. So as I said before, pre-service teachers can be a group that do report high levels of maths anxiety. So it's if it's possible to work with them at the pre-service level and try and give them some strategies to address their anxiety, then this is useful before they go out into the field. So we have been lucky enough to collaborate with some wonderful universities and work with some wonderful pre-service teachers. And so these are just some early findings from some of that work. So in the first project that I want to talk about, this was some research that we did with one university in our Science of Learning Research, Science of Learning Research Centre research, which was an initiative of the Australian Research Council. And this study was working with first-year pre-service teachers enrolled in a primary teacher education course. These teachers were told about a 2-hour informational workshop that they could attend to learn more about maths anxiety and how to address it. And in the workshop in particular, we talked to them about what maths anxiety is, how it impacts on learning, and used all of those different types of research, so research from cognitive psychology, neuroscience, education, social psychology, in order to understand both the impact of state maths anxiety and trait maths anxiety on learning, and also use that research as a rationale for why we might use particular strategies to address state maths anxiety, like emotion regulation, and others to address trait maths anxiety. So before the students participated in the workshop, we asked them to do an online pre-survey, and a couple of months after they did the workshop, we asked them to fill out the same survey to see if we could monitor any change in their attitudes and levels of anxiety. So the online surveys assess maths anxiety, test anxiety, maths teaching efficacy, and value and competence beliefs. And the other measure we had was directly after students completed the workshop, they also completed an evaluation. So we had about 144 pre-service teachers sign up for the study and complete the pre-survey online. Then of those 144, we had 98 teachers who came to do the workshop and completed the evaluation. And then of those 98, we had 81 who then completed the post-survey. And here are some results from the pre-survey questionnaire. So you can see, as we would expect, there's a positive significant correlation between maths anxiety and test anxiety. There's also a negative significant correlation between maths anxiety and maths teaching efficacy, which we would also expect. So teachers, pre-service teachers who were more anxious about maths tended to be less confident about their ability to teach it. The other interesting correlation on here is the correlation between maths teaching efficacy and test anxiety. So you can see that it's nowhere near as strong as the correlation between maths teaching efficacy in maths anxiety. It's interesting to point that out because there are some people who believe that maths anxiety and test anxiety are essentially the same thing. These results suggest that they aren't, because their maths teaching efficacy is having a much stronger relationship with maths anxiety than it is with test anxiety. Okay, so I'm going to gloss over the evaluation results because I want to focus on some of the survey results. So you'll have to believe me when I say that the students were very positive about the workshop. They thought it was very useful for their development as teachers. They enjoyed it. In particular, they really enjoyed learning more about the cognitive and cognitive psychology, neuroscience component of state maths anxiety and its impact on learning. In our experience in delivering the lecture, it was obvious that there were sort of subgroupings within the students that attended. There were some pre-service some students that attended who were very, very highly confident about their maths ability and very much valued maths, and they were attending because they wanted to learn strategies to support their future students. But there were also a group of students who attended who were highly anxious about maths and wanted to learn more about it to address maths anxiety in themselves. It's the latter group that we were really trying to, I guess, get to with the workshop, but it was great to sort of see that the benefit and the value that the highly confident and students also saw in the workshop. But because we could see these different groupings amongst the students that attended, we wanted to create some student profiles so that we could look at some of the results according to these profiles of students. So we did a cluster analysis on some of the items that were included in the pre-survey, in particular the items that were included assessing competence beliefs and value beliefs. And the reason why we did a cluster analysis on these ones is, if you remember towards the beginning of my presentation, I talked about trait maths anxiety and its relationship to Peckrin's control value theory. So maths anxiety is experienced when you have high to moderate value and you combine that with low or poor control. So control can also be assessed through competence beliefs. If you have positive or high competence beliefs, then you feel like you have more control. And if you have, yeah, you get what I'm trying to say there. So we did a cluster analysis to look to see what we could find in terms of profiles amongst the students that attended. And what we found were 3 clusters. So we had one group of students who were highly confident and highly valued maths, who I've mentioned. We had another group who had sort of a mid-level competence competence belief and mid to high value. And then we had a smaller group of pre-service teachers who had quite poor competence beliefs and mid-level value. They didn't like maths, but they thought it was important. Right, so obviously cluster 3 were the ones that we were really interested in. And we found that these students had the highest levels of maths anxiety, as we would have expected. That we found that of the 3 groups, they were the ones where we saw a significant drop in their anxiety from the pre-stage to post completing the workshop. And the most interesting thing for us was to do with workshop attendance. So I think I mentioned at the beginning that this was a research study which was optional. So we went to all of the students that were enrolled in the course and said, we're offering this to our workshop. Do you want to attend? And when they signed up for the study, we asked them to do the online survey and then sent them instructions on attending the workshop. What we found is, I'll just go back to this one. So for cluster 1, we had about 50% of the students that signed up. Then 50% of the students that signed up and did the pre-survey then came to the workshop and attended and completed the workshop. For cluster 2, we had about 2/3 of those students complete the pre-survey and then come to their workshop. And for cluster 3, we had 50%. But when we looked at cluster 3 and looked at the levels of anxiety in this group and compared those levels of anxiety for students who attended the workshop and then didn't attend the workshop, we found that the students in cluster 3 who did not actually turn up to the workshop had significantly higher levels of anxiety. So almost 2 standard deviations higher than the students in cluster 3 who did attend. So this was quite a startling, well, it's not surprising given again that avoidance is a coping strategy for maths anxiety, and perhaps the students in cluster that were from cluster 3, so were highly anxious, thought that they would be doing maths. This was an optional thing, so they thought they weren't going to come. But for us, it just said those were the students that we really, really wanted to work with. Those were the ones that we thought would benefit the most from the workshop. So because we were working with these wonderful unis that I mentioned, this wonderful uni, we decided for take 2 of this work that what we would try is actually integrating the workshop content into a lecture and tutorial that all students enrolled in the primary teacher education course would have to do. So that way, all students would be exposed to the content. And so we collaborated with the same university from the data I showed you before, and one more. And we had a lecture and tutorial. The lecture was delivered by myself and my colleague Kate Reed, and we presented the theory behind our model and our theory. Then we also presented the research and the rationale for the direct approach, and introduced some of the strategies or techniques that we were suggesting to directly address maths anxiety. And then we worked with the university team members to sort of suggest, well, these are some things you could do, and then they developed the content for the tutorial. And the tutorial was about the strategies for addressing maths anxiety and trialing those strategies, talking about them with their peers and implementing them in some scenarios. Now, these are just some preliminary findings from one of the universities, but again, the evaluation findings were very, very positive. You could see that 92% of students agreed or strongly agreed that the that the lecture was useful for their development as a teacher, and 97% said that for the tutorial. Now, 2020 was supposed to be our year for replicating the study and collecting some more research data about it, but 2020 being the year that it's been, we're looking forward to 2021 to try this again and to try and collect some more data around this. But ACER's work in this area is all under the umbrella of an initiative called the Maths Anxiety and Engagement Strategy, or MAES. MAES sits within the philanthropic arm of ACER, which is called the ACER Foundation. And we're hoping through MAES and through this work in collaboration with these 2 universities, and hopefully more, is to sort of promote the use or the inclusion of this content into the curriculum of teacher education courses as a way to address maths anxiety at this stage of the course that it can go through. So our research, we're hoping to continue our research at different levels, so with secondary students, in early childhood and things like that, but the work that I've presented today is just focusing obviously on that pre-service teacher group. And that is it for me. So thank you very much, and I'm gonna wait for the wonderful questions that hopefully Cath has for me.
Thanks, Sarah, for your fascinating presentation. It's really interesting as someone who does not know a lot about maths anxiety to sort of hear about the really clear links between what students experience and then how that links to both, I guess, their learning of mathematics as well as their teaching. We've got some really good questions, so I'll hand over to Cath for probably the next 20 or so minutes for a discussion. Feel free to post any questions in the Q&A function or in the chat so that they can be addressed. Thanks, Cath.
Like Scott Sarah, I'd like to thank you. I have actually heard Sarah speak on many occasions, and I learn something every time I hear her speak. So I keep regretting that I didn't know all this earlier. We have a very early question in the Q&A. Someone wondered whether they could access the maths anxiety learning study. Are there any publications where they can actually access more information about that study, Sarah?
The maths anxiety learning study.
The original one, the one you spoke about very early in the presentation.
Oh, with the students?
Yes.
We haven't published that yet, but we're hoping to later. But if that, my email address is on the screen right now. If that person wants to contact me to find out some more information, I'm happy to talk to them about it.
So watch this space.
Yes.
For more publications. We need a few more questions, but meanwhile, one question that we have is, are there instances where the maths anxiety is particularly attached to particular topics within maths, or is it sort of across the whole range of topics? Has the research sort of noted that there are particular topics which students become, certainly in that short term, more anxious about?
Yeah, I think there are some studies that look at topic-specific anxiety, but many of them aren't things like statistics anxiety, and it's because statistics is a component of maths that is, you know, required across lots of different courses, for instance, at university. But anecdotally, what we know is things like fractions and things like algebra are the ones that tend to cause a little bit more anxiety in students. I mean, there's some research that suggests that maths anxiety peaks at around year 7 and 8, or in early adolescence, which is also the time when algebra becomes much more prominent in the curriculum. So yeah, I think, Cath, you could probably answer that question.
Well, I would have picked those exact same topics that you just chose. And I guess it sort of does start in the primary school when the students are anxious, and I don't think it actually sort of changes. Just because you become an adult doesn't mean to say that anxiety you had as a child has changed. There was another question about, could you elaborate more about the content of the workshops that were conducted?
Sure, I can do that. So in the workshop, so over the 2 hours, we presented our model, so the state versus trait model. We went into really explaining some of the neuroscience research around the experience of maths anxiety. There have been some studies that looked at things like attentional biases present in students that are maths anxious, and some other studies like the one that I talked about in terms of emotion regulation, looking at the brain activation and students that were anxious but did well on the math task, and looking at the fact that they had higher levels of activation in the part of the brain associated with emotion regulation. Then we looked at the trait aspects of maths anxiety and looked at what types of factors are associated with developing those poor control or low control beliefs around maths. Because our sort of approach was that these are some of the fundamental, this is the fundamental thing driving trait maths anxiety. So looking at that in relation to gender stereotypes, in relation to previous experiences struggling with maths, in relation to experiences with teachers and with parents in the home, how things like I was never good at maths, so you're not going to be either, can contribute to students developing poor control beliefs about maths. And then after presenting that, then we sort of went through strategies to address it. So for state maths anxiety, we looked at emotion regulation strategies like mindfulness, expressive writing, deep breathing techniques and positive reframing or reappraisal. And then for the trait aspects of maths anxiety, we looked at using some more cognitive behavioural techniques. So helped the pre-service teachers understand what types of distorted beliefs and negative patterns of thinking that they might have and not even realise it when it comes to mathematics. So things like catastrophizing, black and white thinking, understanding how these things can develop over time and the way that you think about maths and your performance. For instance, you know, the test result that you get, how that your ability to look at that test result and draw an inference about your future performance and how you're never going to be a teacher and things like that. So catastrophizing, how if you got a test result in another subject, you wouldn't necessarily react in the same way. So understanding how those patterns of thinking might be operating in maths, and then challenging and changing some of those ideas. So worked with students to sort of discuss some of those ideas. That was pretty much the workshop. And
Thanks, Sarah. Look, there's quite a few questions now. So the one question was about working with parents. So I guess any suggestions about how parents can be involved in the maths anxiety workshops and things?
We haven't done any work with parents. We've worked with teachers and talked to teachers about what types of things they can do with parents. One of the things that I like to talk about is because so many teachers get so frustrated with that simple statement of, I was never good at maths, so that's why she or he is not good. It can be useful to understand that part of the reason why parents say that is it can be a protective thing. So they might have struggled a lot with maths when they were younger, and saying that to their child might be their way of sort of saying, it's okay, you know, it's not your, it's okay, so you don't have to feel bad like I did. So understanding that it's coming from sometimes it's coming from a place of love is good. Working with parents to understand that in order to combat maths anxiety in the home, it doesn't require things like doing maths. If you're not comfortable doing maths, it doesn't mean you need to do maths, but you can talk about maths positively. Positive maths talk is such a powerful tool for preventing the development of maths anxiety. So what do we mean by positive maths talk? We're talking about thinking about maths as something that is every day, thinking about how it's something that we can all do together in terms of just like the basic things, recognizing when maths is done in the home, even if it's at a really basic level, that's important. And the type of language that we use around maths is not sort of putting, you're a maths person, you're not a maths person. Thinking about the types of things that might influence kids in that way, so that they can start to develop a positive, an internal locus of control or a growth mindset when it comes to maths, thinking that they can put the effort in and get better.
Thank you. Another question, how do we overcome students' anxiety in learning maths, especially for those whose English is not their first language?
That's a good question. So one of the things that we would say is to use that direct approach to try and reduce and regulate, in particular, their state maths anxiety. So in our work with schools, we taught some practicing teachers some of the strategies, and then they went back and implemented those strategies in their classroom. That involved things like, before a maths test, doing some deep breathing exercises or some mindfulness just before. For some teachers, and that was positive. For students who were really, really anxious about maths, asking them to do some expressive writing about maths. So expressive writing is basically where we ask an individual to externalize all of the negative thinking that they might have, and also the emotion onto a page, and then doing that in a way so that no one will ever read it. It's just for them, and they can choose what they want to do with that. They can rip it up, burn it, put it in a drawer, whatever. Teachers said that doing that with students who was very, very anxious, asking them to do that just before they started a maths lesson was very, very effective, particularly for students that were almost getting so worked up they were fainting before maths lessons started. That was quite a powerful thing. So for older students, obviously, who were happy to write. And one teacher said to us that just doing some basic mindfulness before a maths class was really useful. And he sort of said, look, it used to be that when I started my maths lesson, it was like walking on eggshells, but doing this beforehand was quite effective. And it's quite easy. I mean, a lot of people are very, very familiar with using things like mindfulness to improve well-being. So in primary schools, I mean, in Australia, we'll see that after students might come in from lunch, they'll do some mindfulness. Then teachers and people might be less aware that you can actually use something like mindfulness to actually regulate negative emotion, but it is possible too. Sorry, Cath, I think I went a bit off.
Thanks, Sarah. The questions are adding up, but
okay.
Someone has asked for, could you please explain some of the specific strategies for emotional regulation and give specific examples?
Yes, so I've just gone through some of those. So descriptive writing, mindfulness. So what the things that we advocate for the physiological component of state mass anxiety. So the physiological arousal that's associated with it. So sweaty palms, beating heart, things like deep breathing, muscle relaxation techniques, they're very effective for those aspects of state mass anxiety. For the other part, the cognitive part, that's where things like mindfulness, expressive writing, positive reframing, things like that are effective. They're all aspects of emotion regulation.
Well, it's probably not it is a question. Can you suggest any resources, strategies, publications for diagnosing students' anxiety and strategies for addressing? And so and the second part of from the same person is, would running similar workshops for in-service teachers be as impactful as the pre-service teachers?
We've run sessions with in-service teachers and they were effective for the teachers that were anxious. The issue that we have is that pre-service teachers are much happier to admit if they're anxious, whereas in-service teachers are not as happy. So in order to get a group of teachers where we knew we would have some that were anxious, we actually had to go to a school and get the maths leader and some other teachers that were not anxious about maths, as well as the anxious teachers. We had to get them all in there together. Otherwise, it just didn't work to sort of be targeting those in-service anxious teachers, because they just didn't want to participate or wouldn't volunteer, not like pre-service teachers did. So yes, that is as effective. In terms of resources, there's some papers that I've mentioned in the slides, in the bottom of the slides, that talk about the strategies that I've mentioned, and also present some of the research behind the model as well. In terms of diagnosing maths anxiety, I mean, that's a tricky one, because sometimes it can manifest itself in different ways. So for instance, if avoidance is a consequence or a coping strategy for dealing with maths anxiety, then a student that's behaviourally disengaged might actually be anxious about it. So I think diagnosing it is tricky. Yeah. And I think, Cath, you probably have some ideas about that too, about how to do it. But yeah, I mean, one of the ways that you might be able to elicit students to diagnose it in themselves or express that they have it is to to talk about how it's sometimes something that happens in classrooms, and you know, that some students can be anxious about maths, and that it's not a life sentence, and that it's possible to actually reduce it and regulate it and get it to a level where it can actually make you do better. So maybe in talking about it in that way, students might be more open to talk to you about perhaps experiencing it and seek some help.
And I think too, just to add to that, I think most teachers, certainly primary teachers, know their students well enough to know those ones that are doing that avoidance, and you know, the ones that go to the toilet 23 times and then have to have a drink of water, and all, you know, all those typical behaviours. Another question was, can you comment on the continuity between the state and trait of maths anxiety?
Sure, that's a good question. So you can experience state maths anxiety and not have high levels of trait anxiety. So for instance, you might have a student in your class that is extremely anxious when it comes to the tests in maths. And so they might have high state maths anxiety in testing situations, but they do not get anxious in any other situation during learning maths, and they do not get anxious doing their homework. It's only in test situations, for instance, and in particular test situations in maths. But you might have another student who gets anxious about maths when you're learning it, when they're at home doing it, when they're doing a test. So students that have high levels of trait maths anxiety are likely to be anxious about maths whenever it presents itself, because they see it as threatening. But you can experience but you could experience state maths anxiety without having high levels of trait maths anxiety. And also, you've got to understand that state maths anxiety could develop into trait maths, high levels of trait maths anxiety. So let's say you get anxious during a test, you get your test back, and this is something that researchers found. You get your test back and you don't do well. Some students will develop maths anxiety, high levels of trait anxiety subsequent to performing not well on a test, and so then their perception of threat when it comes to maths starts to widen from just the test situation, and they start to develop higher levels of trait maths anxiety.
And I guess the last question for you, although there are several others that haven't been answered, you haven't answered. I think you have answered them indirectly, but there are some other questions that we might need to address later. But the last one for today is, are there any indications or instances of late onset maths anxiety, or does the research suggest that students and teachers will be anxious from quite early on?
I'm not aware of any research looking at adult anxiety at onset of adulthood. I think most of the research that I'm aware of is looking at either students that have started to report their anxiety in primary school, or students who start to report it at the end of primary school / beginning of high school. So looking at more the continuous development over time. Yeah. So it might not happen. It might not happen, but I just don't know that there's any research on it. That's all.
Oh, there you are. There's another research project for you, Sarah.
But I can't tell you the amount of people where I say I do research on maths anxiety, adults who go, oh, I had that, still got it. Yeah.
It's almost as good as saying you're interested in fractions.
That's right. That's right.
So, Scott, am I handing over to you or to Wee Tiong?
I'll just take a minute just to say thank you again to Sarah for joining us today. It's really been fascinating hearing about your research, and certainly looking forward to the findings of some of those studies you've done last year, and looking forward to you getting your 2020 projects done in 2021. As this is our last seminar for the year, I'm just going to pass over to Wee Tiong, who has a few words about this year and looking forward to next year.
Thank you. Thank you, Cath and Scott, for hosting this webinar. On behalf of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, I would like to formally thank Dr. Sarah Buckley for accepting our invitation and for her stimulating presentation in the last hour. My name is Wee Tiong Sia, and I'm privileged to organize this research webinar series for the Math, Science and Technology Education Group. This afternoon's webinar is also the last one for the year, and I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to my colleagues in Math and Science Education for taking turns with me to host the monthly event. For those of you who have been following our webinar sessions especially, you can see that other than the lineup of thought-provoking speakers like Sarah, the spread of expertise and experience amongst the hosts and moderators has also been visible. So, and this is exactly why it has been so energizing for me working, collaborating, and interacting with these and other colleagues here at MGSE. I trust that you will too, so you're most welcome to get in touch with any of them, get to know them, and to explore potential collaborations. Thank you for attending and participating today. We look forward to interacting with you again in the new year when we launch the 2021 series, possibly with a panel discussion reflecting on Australia's performance in Teams 2019, which, as you know, will be released on the 8th of December this year. Well, it will be 9th of December in Australia. So may you have an enjoyable and festive end of year celebration, and keep safe, stay well, and keep connected.